Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Classic Gaming Brothers. I'm Zach.
And I'm Seth.
And we are the Classic Gaming Brothers.
That's right. We are the Classic Gaming Brothers.
That's right. We are.
Yeah. So Zach,
yes, Seth.
Why don't we talk about what we were just talking about while we weren't recording, but now we can talk about it while we're recording, and that was the convention that you went to?
Yes, that's right. I did go to a small convention up in New Hampshire.
And it was Secret Galaxy Con?
It was Secret Galaxy Expo, and it was put together by Dan Larson, aka Secret Galaxy, aka Toy Galaxy, on YouTube.
Yeah, and you got to meet not only Dan Larson, but also our former guest and also brother Mike Case.
I did get to meet our former guest and still brother Mike Case.
Podcast co-host of the Mornings with Mike podcast.
The titular Mike of Mornings with Mike.
We would not have mornings without Mike.
That's right. It was a small convention, but it was really fun to kind of explore. It was mostly toys. I didn't really see much video game related things there. There were some video game toys. There were some Sonic figures that I picked up, some more recent ones, and there was an Exo Squad figure, which I know Exo Squad isn't necessarily a video game, but there was a video game called Exo Squad for the Sega Genesis that I remember playing. When I saw that, I was like, oh yeah, Exo Squad.
Did you buy it?
No. I didn't really like the game, and I don't think I ever watched the show, so I don't really need to know about the toys. But that could be an episode for Mornings with Mike.
Talking about Exo Squad?
Yeah, sure. But it was a fun little convention. I also got to meet the Wicked Joyful guy. For those of you who follow him on Instagram, he puts together some custom, usually comedic figures. Like he did a Clippy action figure. He did one of it's the Nirvana baby. with the dollar. Yeah, he does stuff like that. That's kind of goofy. But yeah, it was a fun time. I went with our father, classic dad, and it was up at Double Midnight Comics up in Manchester, New Hampshire.
Haven't we been there?
We have been there. It's the place we went to with producer Doug.
Yes, we did go to a comic shop with producer Doug on our annual vacation. For the listening audience, the Classic Gaming Brothers and staff go on an annual vacation, which is approved by producer Doug. Well, Zach.
Yes, Seth.
What have you recently been playing?
Seth, recently I've been playing Sonic X Shadow Generations. It's being released on October 25th, 2024. However, I pre-ordered it, so I got access to the game 3 days early. As of the recording of this episode, technically Sonic X Shadow Generations is not out. As of the release, it is out. Now, this is actually, as the name might imply, two different games. It's an HD remaster of Sonic Generations, which was a game that originally came out back in 2011 as part of Sonic's 20th anniversary, and it's a brand new game called Shadow Generations. Shadow Generations isn't really like a DLC or anything of Sonic Generations. It's its own new game with an original story and new gameplay that does tie into the Sonic Generations storyline, so there is a connection. The story of Shadow Generations features the character of Shadow the Hedgehog getting a report about a biological signal being detected on the abandoned space colony Ark. So he travels there and gets sucked into a white void where chunks of his past have been gathered. He also discovers that Black Doom, the alien that Dr. Gerald Robotnik used as the genetic template for Shadow, is still alive. Black Doom and Shadow originally confronted each other back in the 2005 Shadow the Hedgehog game for the GameCube. Now, Shadow has to piece together his past, stop Black Doom from returning to power, and you do it in a game that's pretty fun. You have this big open white void that you have to explore as kind of this hub world, and the void has different sections that you can jump into that will take you to levels inspired by past games that had featured Shadow, or just games games that are part of the Sonic storyline. So one of the first levels you explore is the Space Colony Arc, which of course originally showed up back in Sonic Adventure 2. You also go to Rail Canyon, which showed up in Sonic Heroes. There's a level based on a map from Sonic Frontiers. There's one based on Sonic Forces. So it's kind of an exploration into both Shadow's past as well as his future, as he does show up in those games as well. It's a very fun game. It's a pretty cool game. I like it. I like the combat. Shadow is a bit more of a combat-focused character. He can do different techniques that Sonic can't do, such as shoot a bolt of energy out of his hands. And he also has a quick attack that he does where he kind of teleports and punches enemies and stuff like that. It's a bit more of a combat-focused game in that regard. It's still Sonic, so it's still also speed-focused, but it does have this really snappy combat that I think makes the game really enjoyable and makes going through the levels really fun. But that's Sonic X Shadow Generations, released by Sega on October 25th, 2024. Seth, what about you? What have you been playing?
So recently I've been playing Sinking City by Frogwares, which was released back in February 26, 2021. It's set in the 1920s on the east coast of the United States, and there's a city that's mostly underwater called Oakmount, and it's gripped by some preternatural, supernatural type forces going on. You play as Charles Reed, who's a private eye, and he has weird powers that he knows he has and uses those weird powers to solve crimes. His weird powers are being able to see figments of the crime scenes and also to like get these omens where he can follow where somebody may have run off. He also looks like he really needs a nap. The game kind of plays like a Sherlock Holmes game where you're exploring the city and uncovering crimes and solving mysteries. Frogwares, many of their other games that they've developed were Sherlock Holmes games. So Sinking City is like a Sherlock Holmes games, but set in a weird half-submerged city. And Charles Reed's kind of like Sherlock Holmes if Sherlock Holmes didn't always look really tired or either wanting to kill somebody. Like Charles Reed's face just looks like somebody who's done with life. His eyes are bloodshot. He is just like staring at the screen whenever he's talking, and he just talks like he's very unenthused about everything, which I guess is also Sherlock Holmes. So I've been playing Sinking City on my Steam Deck. I've been really enjoying it. I think I started it once upon a time. I didn't get past the first the first conversation with somebody, and so then I started playing it on the Steam Deck, and I got into the first like mystery, and I started like playing through the areas where you have to uncover clues, and I was like, oh, I actually really like this a lot. And also there is another Frogwares game called Sherlock Holmes Awakened, which they remastered, and at the time that I bought Sinking City, they were bundled together, and for $10 less than the cost of Sinking City, I got both games. So I was very excited about that bargain. The Sinking City definitely has a very Cthulhu type-esque theme to it. The city has some people who look like apes, and then there's some people who look like fish. And the ape people don't like the fish people. But then there's also people that just look human.
Do they like the fish people?
I don't think they care either way, but both people think it's rude when you ask them why they look like apes or fishes.
I mean, that is rude.
And that's because Charles is new to the city.
Is that a frequent question that comes out?
It's an option that you can pick in the dialogue. You could be like, why do you look so weird? But what's great is he can say that to everybody. So like the first person you meet is a human, like a regular person, and he's just wearing like a funny coat. And you could just be like, why are you wearing a funny coat? And as a question that you pick in the dialogue wheel. And then you meet someone who looks like an ape. And you could be like, man, why do you look like an ape? They are releasing Sinking City 2 soon. However, Frogwares is a Ukrainian game developer, and they've been impacted by the war, and they've been impacted by the war since the war started. Actually, one of their staff was actually killed in the war. So any support you can send their way would be great. Buy their games. They're really great. I enjoy them. But working on Sinking City 2 as of recently, because I think some things have at least stabilized for their company.
Well, that's good to hear that some things have stabilized for them. Well, today we're going to be talking about a game that's a memorable game for Seth and my childhood. It's a game that we love. It's a game that we've talked about before a little bit. I think we talked about it as a retro rewind for both of us, as well as I believe a recently played for at least one of us before. But that game is Vectorman. Seth, do you have any memories of Vectorman?
Yeah, Vectorman is one of those games that is really just a lot of fun. You play as a bunch of balls that have congealed themselves into a robot form, and you can blast things with your gun hands. You can shapeshift throughout the game depending on which Vectorman you're playing and what pickups you get, but you can become like a tank and stuff. And I just think it's like a fun game. I think my favorite part of the game, though, is in the second one, I believe. You start off where you drop down, and you can shoot downwards to slow your descent. And I always thought that was fun with the way the physics type worked in the game, where it actually reacted to, like, if you shot your little blasters down, you actually slowed your character down, which was always kind of cool. What about you?
Yeah, no, I think that moment in the game is really memorable to me. Just that opening part where you're kind of like, you have like a little helicopter head going on and you're just dropping down slowly and you can kind of balance yourself using just your energy. I remember the second game really well because I think that was the game we owned first, as with all games that we have where we've owned the sequels first. I also remember it being really hard. I don't think I ever beat it. I remember seeing the ending before because I think I used cheats to get to the ending, where you fight this evil queen who looks like a big spider, and she has this like really high-pitched scratchy voice where she's like, "Destroy, surrender." And I just think Vectorman is a game that it holds up to me in a way that, like, every time I play it, I might not play it for very long. I might only play it a couple stages before I get a game over or something, because it is a tough game. But both Vectorman and Vectorman 2 just have this very Sega vibe to them. Like, I just can't picture a version of Vectorman on a different console that's not a Sega Genesis, because it just feels very pure Sega Genesis. The sound effects are all using that kind of Sega Genesis scratchy sound that you'd expect. Also, the sound effects are very, like, chunky. Like, everything has, like, weight to it. Like, Vectorman's blasts have kind of a weight to it. His jump always has a little, like, I don't know, like whenever he jumps up, you can hear his feet land when he lands back on the ground. There's just kind of a weight to everything you do, and I think that does help the game feel fun to play. Like, almost like where you kill an enemy, it almost feels like the whole screen's gonna shake just with like the way they'll explode.
Yeah, and I also feel like the game is relatively speedy. It like is fast, it's responsive. It definitely shows off the blast processing of the Sega Genesis in regards to how the game reacts. In my mind, just a real good like showing of what a good action platformer kind of thing should look like. A run-and-gun or whatever it is.
Absolutely. Now, to get into the history of Vectorman, it was developed by Blue Sky Software, and Vectorman came about after the release of two other successful Sega games that the company put together. One of these games would be the work that they did on a game called Starflight, and another game would be the Master System and Game Gear ports of Joe Montana Football.
Nice.
Yeah, I love Joe Montana Football. For a little context for our listeners who might not have heard before, I, for some reason, got into my head that I really needed to own both Joe Montana Football 1 and Joe Montana Football 2 for the Sega Genesis, solely because the cover for both of those games is nearly identical. Looks like it was taken from the same photo shoot. It's just Joe Montana is slightly more like leaning backwards in the second photo versus the first one. I just think that's hilarious that they really didn't reach hard to remake the cover for that game. The game Starflight and the Master System and Game Gear ports that they did for Joe Montana, these weren't the first Sega games that Blue Sky would work on. They had actually been involved in working on video games and Sega games for a bit. They developed Ariel the Little Mermaid in 1992 for the Genesis, Game Gear, and Master System, which was also a popular game as it was a Disney game. And they've been involved in the scene. However, their work on Starflight and Joe Montana Football did help make their name better known to Sega corporate. And after the release of those titles, Blue Sky would sign an exclusivity deal to develop games for the Sega Genesis. Around the same time, Sega also won a bidding war to develop a game based on Jurassic Park. And Sega would give the development of Jurassic Park to Blue Sky, who would go ahead and make two games, Jurassic Park and Jurassic Park Rampage Edition. After the two Jurassic Park games were released, Sega turned to their next project. They wanted a game that could tackle Donkey Kong Country. They wanted a game that could utilize a pre-rendered 3D model in the same way that Donkey Kong Country did, and they wanted to capitalize on the technology as a way to prove that Sega could do what Nintendo also was doing.
Now, Carl Robilier, the developer for Blue Sky, saw some vector designs for the Amiga, which were developed by a small scene group, a group that would be developing demos for the various new hardware that was out. So it could be like a video or some sort of animation. And he got the idea to make a 3D tech demo based on a 3D pre-rendered balls. He saw some 3D pre-rendered balls, and he said, I've got an idea. Now, while the development began on this project of balls, Sega ultimately stopped caring as they realized that Donkey Kong Country would be too big to tackle. They were also anxious due to the issues with the Sega 32X being a flop and the Saturn's launch going downhill. Internally, Sega was also struggling as the Japanese and American branches didn't communicate, which we've talked about this in the past. A lot of our theories in why Sega did compete as well as time moved on was because of the disagreements between the Japanese and the American branches. Sega Japan wanted to focus on the Saturn because they developed that. But Sega of America thought they shouldn't isolate their Genesis fans because they developed the 32X. They really liked the Sega Genesis. Now, Blue Sky Software continued to work on the game with the balls, and it had a very playable state. The game used a technique that Sega called vector piece animation, where each segment of the Vectorman and the other sprites of the game were animated separately. So, technically, Vectorman was not just one sprite like Sonic or Mario. He was in fact 23 individual sprites that moved in unison, so it was like he was 23 Marios all at once. This allowed the game to run at 60 frames per second, which is why I say that the game plays really fast because of this whole sprite control.
It's smooth as butter when you're playing it.
It is very smooth, and it's a lot of fun being a robot made of balls. But as Sega was being busy being Sega, Blue Sky was able to take on most of the creative control of Vectorman because Sega they were either too busy or they didn't care.
It was a little bit of both.
Yeah, depending on which office you were talking to. And with most of Sega's changes to the game coming in towards the end of development, where they were kind of locked into a lot of particular choices.
Now, some things that did change throughout development was the idea to have every character in the game made of spheres, or balls. But this was scrapped because they thought it was just a bit too abstract. They had this design for Vectorman, who was made up of all these different balls, but what it boiled down to is they thought Vectorman kind of stood alone as his character, and having all of the characters made of balls just made it a little too bally, I guess. I don't know. Like, they just thought it was too spherical. Also, another design they had was they wanted to have enemies have wind-ups to their attack. So when an enemy was coming to attack you, they would do a wind-up first, and then they would attack, and then they would kind of do a slowdown after they wound up. But this ended up just slowing down the gameplay, so it kind of hampered on the speed that they were going for. Music in the game would be composed by filmmaker and musician John Holland, who drew influence from the techno works like Kraftwerk, The Prodigy, and Orbital. John struggled with getting the music to sound the way he wanted due to the Genesis sound chip, but personally, and I think Seth might agree with me, the music sounds pretty good, and I'll drop in some Vectorman music right here. The game was pretty much complete. They needed to get it up and running, so they started the marketing portion of development. And one way that they were going to hype up sales of the game was through a promotional contest that Sega would run. The contest was called Play to Win $25,000 and was actually almost like a golden ticket style of contest. Basically, certain copies of Vectorman, the first game, would feature a secret ending with a telephone number. Players who called the number will then have the chance to receive a replacement copy of of their game without the telephone number. And there was also a chance to win upward to $25,000, which was the grand prize. There were also 10 first prizes of $10,000 and 90 second prizes, which were Sega Saturn consoles. The rules, which I thought this was interesting, is they actually factored this into the contest. The rules did state that a rental copy could not be eligible for either the store that owned the rental copy or the person renting the copy. So a little caveat to the game. They wanted people to own it. According to an archived article from 1996, a 12-year-old boy would actually be the winner of the $25,000, though I couldn't find evidence of how many of the first prizes or the 90 second prizes were claimed, but the $25,000 was definitely claimed, which makes me wonder, and a couple of people on the internet are wondering the same thing, so it's not just me, how many golden ticket Vectormans are still out there? Like, how many Vectorman copies are still out there where if you get to a certain point of the game, toward the end, you will see the telephone number still? Because in order to claim the prize, Sega had to take back the cartridge. They would send you a replacement. So that means if not all the prizes were claimed, there could be a couple floating around.
And we were pretty bad at Vectorman. Our copy could have it.
I was thinking the same thing. I might have to actually play through Vectorman now.
Could you dump the ROM and just figure out?
I probably could. I need a ROM dumper, but I could probably do that.
So Vectorman was released in 1995, and it sold pretty well. It became one of the best-selling games in the 1995 holiday season, and by the end of the year, sold about 500,000 copies. So 101 of those could have been golden. And so there's a small percentage that you would actually have gotten it unless they put out more, unless it was a first come first serve.
To be honest, I think that's why Sega was taking back the cartridges. So when you won first prize or any of the prizes, they would claim you would mail back your copy of Vectorman that had that golden ticket phone number. That's what I'm calling it. It wasn't actually a golden ticket, but would have that phone number. And I think it's so that they could actually put them back into the market, so that like if some of the prizes hadn't been claimed yet, they could keep it going.
That's fair. Yeah, maybe. I don't know. We would have to call up somebody from Sega who worked there at the time.
Hey, if you worked for Sega, email us.
Yeah, specifically in the promotions department in 94 to 95. So by the end of 95, 500,000 copies. However, Donkey Kong Country 2 also was released around that time, and Donkey Kong Country 2 went on to sell about 900,000 copies. So Vectorman was not the Donkey Kong killer, but it still did all right for itself. It did also earn praise from the critics of the time, with GamePro giving the game a 5 out of 5 for its graphics, control, and fun factor, and a 4.5 out of 5 for sound. EGM would give the game an 8.25 out of 10, largely pointing out how good the graphics were. The publication Video Games, the Ultimate Gaming Magazine, also praised the game and stated that it will be a cold day in hell before 16-bit is dead and buried. Well, yeah, just a little while after this. But anyway, the sales, despite not being Nintendo level sales, were still enough to immediately greenlight a sequel, Vectorman 2. Aptly named. Mostly because Vectorman himself was aptly named because he was based on the whole vector
Vector graphics, yeah.
It's just like if somebody was called Pixel Man and they're like, Pixel Man 2 will come out. And now, however, development on Vectorman 2 was rushed as the Genesis was nearing the end of its life. So they wanted to make money, but they had to make money fast. And with 1996 rolling by, the console was seeing less and less new titles as people moved on to more advanced consoles.
Now, to help ease the development of the sequel, the game was built on top of the first game's engine. This meant that the gameplay would be virtually the same, but the levels were cut down in size and scope. Vectorman 1 has some pretty large levels. They are large and sprawling. Vectorman 2's levels, not so large. Some of them are kind of big. I do recall level 2 was this kind of large treetop area that you had to explore, but most of them in size are smaller than the first game. The enemies were also redesigned for the sequel. In the first game, the enemies are all robots, while in the sequel, they're bugs, like beetles and grasshoppers and ants. Another contest would actually be held for Vectorman. This was specifically for one of Vectorman's morph transformations. So we'll talk about it a bit in the gameplay, but Vectorman does have the ability to transform because he's just made of balls. So the balls can rearrange themselves, and thus Vectorman can take on different abilities using these transformations. So there was a contest that was run where the person could design one of these morphs, and the winner not only got their morph used in the game, but they also had a special screen put into the game that you could find in the Vectorman 2 options menu. If you go into the options, you'll see a little text that says contest winner, which you can click on, and from there you'll get a screen where Vectorman is kind of shaped like a walking tank, and there's a message that says, "Congratulations, Josh Krebs, winner of the Vectorman Morph Contest." And that's just fun. So Josh Krebs, if you're out there, you did it, and I hope that you know that you were immortalized in Vectorman 2. Now, Vectorman 2 would also feature some voice samples, which was new to the game, with these voices being primarily Vectorman. There's a clip of him just saying his name. Vectorman. There is also clips of him speaking at the beginning of each level. So when you enter a level, he'll go like, T1. And then the level will begin. And that's kind of just how the voice samples are used. And as mentioned, the final boss also has some spoken lines, specifically saying destroy and surrender, which I probably dropped in earlier. John Holland would be brought back to compose the music, and I think Vectorman 2 has some also equally great music, which I will drop in a little here. Vectorman 2 would be released in November of 1996, and it was equally praised on release, with many people noting the fact that this was a game that wasn't a licensed tie-in title for the Sega Genesis. In 1996, as Seth mentioned, the Genesis titles were few and far between because the console was on its way out. So when a game would come out for the Genesis around this time, it was typically a licensed movie tie-in. So people were happy this was a new game, a game that wasn't part of the license, not a spin-off. This was a new game. People did prefer the original game, however, in terms of its size and overall gameplay, but Vectorman 2 was still praised for its graphics and sound. GamePro would give the game a 4.5 out of 5 for its graphics, and the rest of the game would earn a 5 out of 5 from them. EGM would give the game a 7.25 out of 10. EGM would also award the game with Genesis Game of the Year, which probably wasn't hard because there were only a handful of non-tie-in, non-sports games released in 1996 for the Sega Genesis, so you had slim pickings for your Genesis Game of the Year. But hey, I think Vectorman 2 deserved it.
Now, in both Vectorman games, you play as the titular Vectorman. The game is set in the future when pollution has led to the Earth being mostly wiped out. Kind of like WALL-E. A robot named Raster, who is a supervisor robot for the cleanup crew that is working on making Earth habitable again, actually gets fused to a nuclear warhead. He changes his name to Warhead, and then he goes insane, vowing to destroy humanity and control all of the robots. His influence is able to take control of all of the robots on Earth, with the exception of Vectorman, who would have been taken over if he was on the planet, but he wasn't on the planet at the time.
He was doing a mission.
Which I believe was cleaning something else.
I think he was literally dropping off trash.
Yeah, he was probably dropping off trash. Vectorman is a garbage man. And in the Vectorman 2, you drive around, well, in the beginning of the intro, he's driving his giant garbage ship.
Yeah.
Now, so when Vectorman returns, he decides that he has to stop Warhead and his army of robots. In Vectorman 2, Vectorman is still working as a robot trash man and is on a mission when his ship is attacked and destroyed. He escapes and lands on a planet that has mutant insects inhabiting the area. He then decides to destroy the insects and kill their evil queen because they were attacking him. Now, both games are platformers, action platformers even, where you control Vectorman. He could jump, he could do a little double jump or a boost to get to higher areas, and his weapons are hand cannons that shoot star-shaped blasts of energy, also look like things that you need to pick up. There's these little floating stars that you pick up to get points. There's also power-ups that will change the weapon briefly, such as turning it into a straight laser beam, a ricochet beam, a rapid fire, or an area effect weapon. Vectorman is made up of different orbs, so he is able to also morph into different things if the appropriate power-up is found, such as a helicopter, a tornado, or a tank.
However, you can only do these briefly, so Vectorman can turn into a tornado, but only for like a couple seconds, not for the rest of the game.
Unless the level specifically is about him being in the other form. Like the intro of Vectorman 2, he's a helicopter, but he's not like a full helicopter. He's just like an Inspector Gadget helicopter, where his like propeller head and then he can hover and shoot things as he descends slowly to the ground.
Yeah. I like with Vectorman, you mentioned earlier, you said Vectorman being named Vectorman's fun because his name comes from vectors, like vector graphics. And earlier you said it would been like if the character was named Pixel, and it was just a pixel. Raster, who becomes Warhead, his name comes from raster graphics. And that was the original idea, is he would be raster because he is the opposite of vector. I just think that's kind of silly. Now, a third game was actually planned, Vectorman 3, which was going to be released on the PS2, but it got canceled. The sequel had started out as a potential title for the Sega Saturn, but then the Sega Saturn kind of died, and then it was moved to the Sega Dreamcast, and then the Sega Dreamcast kind of died. Finally, it moved to the PS2. The game would have been a third-person action adventure game where you play as Vectorman. Again, in one of the early prototype screenshots that were shown off, it has an image of Vectorman holding a big laser sword, and he also kind of vaguely looks like Master Chief. This Master Chief comparison is actually intended. They wanted him to look like Master Chief. In fact, the Vectorman 3 design did go through a couple of iterations, one of them being an early design where he looks almost identical to his original spherical self. But when Halo came out and everyone wanted to be Master Chief, they thought they could redesign him to look a bit more like the Halo character. A presentation of Vectorman 3 would be shown at E3, but the game would be canceled because Sega decided that they didn't want to make it. I believe, and I don't have evidence for this, but I believe part of the reason is because Sega did make a shift a little before this time to becoming a third-party developer, and they likely wanted to make their focus on IPs that they knew they could make money on, because the Dreamcast had failed, the Saturn had failed. So I can see Sega being like, well, Vectorman's cool and all, but it's not going to make us a ton of money, so like we'll maybe invest in another Sonic game or something. That's just my own thinking. Now, the first two and the only Vectorman games would get re-released on PC in the Sega Smash Pack 1 and the Sega Smash Pack 3 in 1999 and 2000 respectively. They also appeared in the Sonic Gems Collection in 2005, the Sonic Genesis Collection in 2006, Sonic's Ultimate Genesis Collection in 2009, and they were re-released on the Wii Virtual Console in 2008 and brought to Steam in 2010. And they were also included on the Sega Genesis Mini and the Sega Genesis Mini 2. So the Sega Genesis Mini has Vectorman 1, Sega Genesis Mini 2 has Vectorman 2.
I just watched a trailer that was for Vectorman 3. I'm glad that they didn't make it. It looks very muddy.
I think the trailer is from like the late stage one where he kind of looks more like Master Chief, and it is a very muddy looking game.
Yeah, it's a very muddy looking game.
There's some earlier designs from the like early iterations where he was a bit more ball, and those look a little bit more fun, but at the same time it's still just, I don't know. I don't think Vectorman looks good as a 3D model. I think he just looks better as the multi-sprite design that they put him as. I think 2D does a lot of heavy lifting and making Vectorman look good.
Yeah, for sure.
But that will do it for our Vectorman episode. So that's Vectorman, a great game, a game that we love, a game that we'll talk about again someday, and a game that I might just literally just go grab my copy and play to see if we have the winning copy. Who knows? If we do, I'm calling Sega. I'm getting my money. Anyway, Seth, do you want to take us into our retro rewind?
Sure. Zach had me play Empire War Game of the Century for MS-DOS. Empire, War Game of the Century is based on the 1977 turn-based war game Empire. And there's also Empire Deluxe. Empire was developed by Walter Bright back in 1977. Empire War Game of the Century was also developed by Walter Bright and released in 1987. And also he had Mark Baldwin help with the 1987 release. In the Empire series of games, you play as a commander, and you have a town that generates units, and they just generate every so many turns, and then you can use your turn to move the units. They're like maybe an army unit or a fighter unit or a ship unit, like a destroyer. You use your units to go and conquer other cities on the map, and each city then, once you conquer it, it will generate another unit. So then you make more armies. You can set the different cities to make different units. Each city generates one unit. It's a pretty simple game. It can be played via mail. I think email. but in the game it just said, do you want to play this game by mail? And I was really hoping it would be by snail mail. But yes, you can play it by email. The one drawback I had was whatever sound blaster sound thing I had situated, whenever I select the unit made a noise, and that noise was just like a loud drumming noise depending on the unit. Sometimes it was a deep drumming noise, sometimes it was a high-pitched drumming noise, it was a rapid drumming noise, and it was annoying. It kind of sounded like my ears were going to explode, but it was fun. The original Empire game would influence a young Sid Meier's, who would go on to use the Empire framework to develop his Civilization series, and is quoted saying that it 100% influenced the Civ series. And when I played it, it feels like a simplified Civ game. If you want to check out a game like Empire, to probably check out an earlier Civ game. However, I'm not saying don't check out Empire War Game of the Century. There may be other later editions of Empire, but it holds up. It's a simplified war game. It's a lot of fun. It's fast. I enjoy it. Maybe Zach will play it via email. Next week, Zach, you could play Hyper Ira for the NES, released in 1995.
Okay, sounds good. Now, Seth had me play Extreme Paint Brawl for MS-DOS. A fun fact about Extreme Paint Brawl is that it's listed as one of the worst games of all time. I did not know this going into it. I entered this 1998 MS-DOS build engine game from Creative Carnage, being only familiar with it by name. You see, I remember hearing about Extreme Paint Brawl at one point, but I couldn't remember why I've heard about it. I then started playing it, and then I realized why I was familiar with it by name. I have in fact heard of this game when I watched videos, those videos that explain to you what the top 10 worst video games of all time are. Being in the build engine, I had anticipated the game was going to play well. The build engine is something that was used for games like Duke Nukem, Blood, Shadow Warrior, games that I'm familiar with, games that I love, games that I've played. But for some reason, Extreme Paint Brawl in fact plays terribly. To explain the game, you play as one of 8 different paintball players that you can toggle between. You must tag out a rival team member by hitting them with paintballs. Paintballs fly inaccurately, and you will often find yourself tagged out before getting anyone. So, like, for example, I was playing as the blue team, a red team member was in my line of sight, I opened fire at him, missed every shot, and he hit me once and I died. What is odd, though, is I have no idea how to fix the really annoying controls. I might have to go into a config file like in DOSBox, like in this particular game, but the controls are all mapped to the numpad and the mouse, meaning like I had to like really lean weirdly into trying to get this game to play any form of comfort. Also, what was obnoxious is that the mouse is inverted. Now, this is something that is common in older types of first-person shooter games. They did do inverted mouse controls. However, I couldn't find a way to change this, so they stayed inverted, and it was a little disorienting. It was an annoying game to play, and I did try to remedy this. I actually did try to see if I could get this game to play in a way that would make me enjoy it. So I downloaded a couple of build engine source ports, specifically eDuke. But no, none of these source ports currently support Extreme Paint Brawl because I don't think anyone wants to play it. Does the game hold up? No, it does not hold up. It is, as people have described, one of the worst games of all time. And I really hope that someday someone can make a proper source port being able to run it, because I want to experience it in its glory. Next week, Seth, you can play a build engine game as well. This time you can play Nom for MS-DOS.
Cool. I'm very excited to look forward to that. Well, thanks for listening, everybody. If you would like to tell us how great we did in that episode, or how bad we did, you can always send us an email at classicgamingbrothers@gmail.com. You can also follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitch at Classic Gaming Brothers, and on Twitter and Blue Sky, we're at CG Brothers Pod. You can also find us at wherever podcasts are able to be listened to on any listening app and on YouTube, and give us a subscribe there. And finally, you can head over to our website and check it out. And that's gonna be it. Zach, am I forgetting anything?
Don't play games like my brother.
And don't play games like my brother.
I've been Zach.
And I've been Seth.
And we've been the Classic Gaming Brothers.
That's right.
That's right.